Hello, class. So today we're going to talk about the three paradigms of social science research and what they are and why they are important as you continue to study social science throughout your career. So why paradigms exactly? So here's the thing. There's a lot of ways to look at the world, and depending on the basic assumptions that you have about reality, about people, about institutions, will then affect how you go about studying it. So there are basically, for our purposes, three major paradigms that people seem to mostly fall under. And the thing is about paradigms is that they're not always clear cut, like some people can be a mix of different ones. And they're essentially a summary of a set of beliefs that people tend to have that go together and form a paradigm. But what you're going to learn is that there is no perfect paradigm, okay? And that every paradigm has strengths and limitations. And so nobody has all the answers, essentially, is the idea, okay? So it's like that little saying, there are no solutions, there's only trade-offs. It's the same thing here as well when it comes to the study of social science. And so that's the plan we're going to talk about today, is what are these paradigms and how exactly do they work. Okay, so the first paradigm that you probably have heard of and are very well acquainted, if not through your high school training, then perhaps through other classes that you've taken, is the social science paradigm. And the social scientific paradigm is one where that people treat social science like as if it is like a natural science in a way. So basically, social science in general, like as a definition, is an organized method of research of combining empirical observations of behavior with inductive and deductive logic to confirm and test theories that are then used to describe or predict human behavior. So, in other words, the social scientific paradigm has a set of beliefs and practices that make it scientific in nature. So we're like scientific, okay? And so we're going to talk about some of these now. So when you're talking about the social science paradigm, you're talking about one of the first things is the empiricism. Okay? So in the social scientific paradigm, the focus is on the philosophy of empiricism. Empiricism is the idea that the only things that we should be concerned about in science are things that we can verify with the senses. Now, this is based off of, and see, often this is called positivism. And positivism is this basic idea that if the idea cannot be verified with the senses, then it's basically meaningless. Now, you might have heard of something called logical positivism. And that's logical positivism here. And what we call it today is post-positivism. Sorry, kind of hard to say. And what basically happened was in the 1800s, you had David Hume, and he was the one who first came up with this idea of logical positivism, which was basically, if it can't be confirmed with the senses, it shouldn't count as knowledge. And so, that was kind of the thinking for a while with science. Well, then basically in the 1930s, people started to realize like there's problems with logical positivism. Okay, number one, that statement in itself can't be proven. So like the statement like if it can't be verified with the senses, then it should be thrown out. Well, that statement itself can't be verified with the senses, so that's a problem. But on top of that, the other issue was that science isn't just about logic and the physical senses. Sometimes it's about sociology. Sometimes an idea just isn't popular at the time, so people get persecuted, so it doesn't get published, or they get thrown out of their science, and then hundreds of years later we find out, oh, that person was right, like Galileo. Darwin was rejected at first, you know. So science isn't entirely based on what we see and hear, it's also what we're inclined to believe as well. And so that kind of did it for logical positivism as well. So what we have today now are post-positivists who have basically said, yeah, there are some problems, but we still like this idea of like things need to be empirical. Okay, so that's one of the major things about the social scientific post-positivist paradigm. So another term for this, if you wanted to, and what you'll probably hear it as more often, is post-positivist paradigm. Because, you know, even though it's technically social scientific, we could argue that all three paradigms are social science, but just by different definitions of social science. So the key philosophy of the social scientific paradigm is empiricism, okay? The idea that everything should be measured by the senses. Now, oops, trying to go to purple here. Okay. See, I got this new little like app thing for PowerPoint, and it's pretty cool. And then I have a cool stylus, so now I can change colors. I really wish I had a laser pointer though, like it doesn't seem to be there, but you know, otherwise it's pretty cool. Okay, anyways, technological innovation. Okay, the key method is the scientific method. And the scientific method is used in the post-positivist paradigm to systematically study something. So far we've said that social scientific paradigm is all about studying things with the senses in a systematic way where we can predict, and that's another thing we'll talk about. So to do that, we use the scientific method. And their scientific method goes this way, okay? So it goes like this. Number one, you have theory. And with a theory, you basically come out and say, here's a theory that's out there, okay, that's been supported by other people. There's a theory that when people play a lot of video games, they become violent and they start hitting people. Okay, so let's say that's a theory. So the more video games you play, the more violent you become. Let's say there was a theory out there that was getting a lot of support. So what you want to do is you want to build on this theory, okay? So what you want to do is you want to try to, you know, prove that like that this theory is a possibility. So what you want to do though is you want to extend the theory in some way. So what you might do is you might come up with an experiment where you want to kind of see, well, is this theory true with girls? Because see, let's say the theory was just about guys, okay? So now what you want to do is, well, does this theory apply to girls? So what you'll do is you'll come up with a hypothesis. And the hypothesis should go along with what the theory already says. So if the theory theorizes that increased video game playing will cause violence, then your hypothesis when you study girls should be, if girls play a lot of video games, they're going to be violent too. So then you do your testing. That's the third part. And in the testing part, that's where you actually see if this happens. Now we're going to learn about design of experiments and like how exactly do people would test this. So maybe you would have a variable group and a control group, and then you would kind of see like, okay, do the girls who play video games become more violent, or do these regular girls over here, is it about the same? You know, so that's where you would do the testing. And then once you have your results, you have your, you know, your book calls it a generalization. You know, I would call it generalization or feedback. And what this is this is the takeaway from the testing. So like, if you found that girls are also more violent when they play video games, then your generalization would be extending this theory. So you would be essentially arguing that this theory also applies to girls based on the test results here, which supports my hypothesis, you see? So in the post-positivist paradigm, what they're interested in doing is taking theories, expanding on them through using the hypothesis that they provide in their predictions, testing those hypotheses, and then trying to improve the theory through generalizations and feedback based on the experiments that you've done. Okay, so that's what post-positivism, the social scientific paradigm, is all about. Now, there's more to this. So I'm going to erase the board here. Lovely erase button, so cool. Okay, all right, let me get back to purple here. Okay, so that's the key. So with post-positivism, it's based on empiricism, and you use the scientific theory. Now, let's talk about the purpose. The point of post-positivism is to discover new theories, okay? And that's the key word, is discover. Okay, I'm putting that in quotes. Essentially, we're trying, these theories are out there, we just got to discover them. So like there is some causal mechanism that's like causing guys to become more violent when they play video games. We just got to discover it. So we just got to see where it is out there. And then once we can like discover it and write it down and create variables and do all that stuff, then we've solved the problem, or we've completely understood the problem. And it's not just about discovering, it's discovering a theory that we can then make predictions with. So what we should be able to do then, if the theory is good, is that if a guy is acting violent, then we should be able to predict that perhaps he plays a lot of video games. Or if somebody is playing a lot of video games, we should be able to predict then with a strong level of confidence that he's going to be violent. Okay? So a good theory in the social scientific paradigm is prediction. You should be able to predict something to happen in the future. Now, on their views on reality, reality is something that's out there. So you notice how we say, like, you got to discover the theory that's out there. Well, reality is something that's out there that can be identified and explained. So it's a realist ontology, if you want to be really smart about it. So realist just basically says like the world out there is real, like, and it doesn't care about us. Like, it's just out there, it exists, and it doesn't matter what we do. The world is the world. Too bad, you know. And that's, I mean, that's kind of a simplification because there's different kinds of realism, but just to make it simple, that's kind of the basic explanation. And so reality is out there. We just got to discover it and just figure out how to best explain it. And then the value, in terms of values, post-positivism, or, you know, social science, whatever you want to call it, is objective. So the argument is that we can leave aside personal biases, that they have no place in the social science world, and that we can be objective and value-free in when we study as well. Like, so if I put out a survey of people who take violent video games, I can make it so the survey doesn't have any of my biases in them. Okay, so that we can be completely objective when we study something. Okay, and then views on human nature. So for social scientists, we're like mammals. Okay, and that's not saying that humans have the same rights as animals, but it's just like we're just another part of the animal kingdom, and so we may have things in common with them. So then you have things like evolutionary psychology, which kind of studies how our minds have evolved over periods of times due to evolution, and, you know, tracing back to like the triune brain theory and all that stuff. And then a good theory for post-positivism is that it should be causal, and it should have axioms or postulates, and those are basically just little statements that say with X, when X happens, Y happens. So a good post-positivistic theory is causal. It'll explain how and why something happens, or at least how something happens, and it can give us a prediction. And then as far as good and bad explanation and claims, so like a good claim, okay, is one that is empirical, meaning it's supported by the data, and it's replicable. I'm going to use a thinner because that might be hard to read. So empirical and replicable. So one of the important things with the social scientific paradigm is that whatever I claim, it's supported by data that's verifiable and often quantified, okay? And we'll talk about quantitative versus qualitative methods and like how they're used, but social scientific paradigm is generally going to be very quantitative. And so they're going to want their data to be empirical and a lot of times quantitative. And then replicable, whatever study you do, other people should be able to replicate it and come to similar conclusions. So replication is another important aspect of doing these kinds of studies. So here are some things now. So now that we kind of understand like what the social scientific paradigm or post-positivist paradigm is all about, you know, every paradigm is going to have some limitations, okay? And so when you think of this, one of the things that you should think about is that, you know, number one, here, let me clear this out. Number one, it's kind of the it's kind of this Albert Einstein thing, Albert Einstein quote, "Not everything that counts can be counted." So there's this Albert Einstein quote, it's not everything counts that can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. So to successfully do social scientific research, you have to be able to quantify things. And the problem is, not all things are quantifiable. Like, how do you quantify love? How do you quantify attraction when it's so complex? And not all things that you can quantify really matter all that much, but they can be made to, if you know what I mean. So that's one of the problems, is that we can't always narrow everything down to one sense or to one particular survey. You see what I mean? There's always opportunities for other kinds of complexities. You know, number two, you know, and this is kind of more quantitative issues more than anything else, but like empirical theories are general. You know, they are meant to be general, but not particular. So it's kind of this critique that goes with statistics, which is that statistics describes people in general, but no one in particular. The empirical theories that get produced by social science, they're usually very broad, but the problem is that they don't necessarily account for all the particulars that you also have to think about when you're in an actually particular situation. So like, we might have a theory that says that the more people play violent video games, the more likely they become violent. But what if you play violent video games with your family and it's just fun and games? It's in the context of fun and games more than it is like serious, like, oh, I'm killing people, yeah. You know, like that kind of thing. Like, you're just kind of, oh, we're just hanging out. Oh, we're just playing Call of Duty because there's nothing else to do. You see what I mean? So, because everything happens in a context. Nothing really happens in the abstract. Everything is always in the context of something. You see? So it doesn't always account for those contextual things that do matter at the end of the day. I mean, it might make a nice theory on paper, but then when you're trying to understand things in practice, you understand that, like, or you learn that, like, there's a lot of things that come into play. So that's another issue. And so another one also is that, you know, a lot of people have trouble with objectivity. Because, like, is there an objective definition of love? Is there an objective definition of privacy, like, that transcends all of culture and all people, no matter what? Because some people would argue there isn't. The culture that you're in or the situation that you grew up in, people can have multiple definitions of privacy. So it's hard to say that there's only one cause or there's only one theory. A lot of times human nature is so complex that there's never really just one theory that explains anything. You need multiple theories. So multiple theories are often necessary. Number 4, we haven't been able to produce any laws. We haven't produced any laws in social science. So we can produce a lot of really interesting theories, but social science hasn't produced any laws. So a lot of people are like, oh, social science, we're like physics and chemistry. Well, but we haven't produced any laws. And you need laws as a foundation for really coming up with progressive theories that build on each other. You see what I mean? And then lastly, actually, no, that's good enough. We'll just do those 4. Okay, so these are some just basic problems. If you're all like, I like social science and I'm post-positivist, well, these are some problems that you have. Now, are these terminal problems so you have to quit being post-positivist? No, these are limitations that certainly people can reply to. So that's one of the things you have to learn about social science is it's not math. I mean, I don't even know if that's a fair comparison, but it's like everything is a conversation in social science. Like there is like finality is something that just doesn't exist, I don't think. Every theory makes progress. Every theory is a work in progress. Every theory is in beta. Like it's like Facebook, right? If Facebook came out and said, Facebook is done, we're final, we don't have to make any more upgrades, then Facebook is dead, right? Like in Silicon Valley, if you say a program is finished, then it's dead. The only way it's alive is that it's still being updated. It's still keeping up with the trends. Same thing with a theory. The only alive theories are the ones that are still constantly being improved upon, responded to, and so forth. No theory is really ever final, if you know what I mean. Okay, so that's the social scientific paradigm. Let's move on to the next one. The interpretive paradigm. So some people would have a problem, okay, with the social scientific paradigm. They would look at it and they would say, you have to come up with this objective definition of what love is, but don't you know that that's a cultural thing? And different cultures look at love and courtship a lot differently than American cultures do. So whatever definition you come up with, it's going to be reflective of your conception of love, but not their conception of love. And so you're just imposing your meanings onto them, but that's not necessarily how they do it, because they look at the world differently than you do. So this is the foundation of interpretivism. So interpretivism still approach theory, they still have data, and they still study reality. But the key thing with interpretivism is that they believe social reality, and even some would argue physical reality, social reality is socially constructed, meaning that the social world that you live in is constructed simply by other people, right? Like there's really no such thing as like a job progression, okay? There's no such thing as recruiting people. There's no such thing as baseball, third base in nature, right? It's something that we all made up in our minds. There's no such thing as the university in nature. It's not like you watch Planet Earth and they're like, there are the zebras going to the University of Zimbabwe and here's another zebra lecturing. No, it's like, no, zebras just chill and they like run around and not get eaten by lions, right? Like that's kind of what they do. The university doesn't exist. It's something that we created in our minds. A lot of the things that you do on an everyday basis are things that we've just socially made up by disagreeing to play this game, okay? So social reality then is socially constructed. Now, some would argue physical reality is too, and the arguments get a little bit deep, but the idea is that even if you understand the world like through science, science in itself is a social reality that we've made up. Because there's other ways to think about nature other than like, kingdom, phylum, class, genus, species, whatever, or like, food chain, all that. I mean, there's other ways to look at that nature that can work. You see what I mean? But the idea is that social reality is something that is constructed within and among people in a society. So in that case then, you can't study humans the same way you study animals, like they do in social science or in post-positivism. Studying humans is not like doing physics and chemistry, okay? Humans are not things. Humans are more like people. Humans are humans. Okay, so you can't use all these little, like if we just control these and these behaviors in people, then it's just like physics and chemistry, and then we can make predictions and all that stuff. Some people would really object to that. So the focus then isn't on prediction, it's on sense making. What the interpretivist's job is to do is to make sense of what people believe and what they do, why they do what they do. Not by predicting, but by understanding. So in social science, it's all about predicting. In interpretive, it's all about understanding. So let's kind of break this down a little bit. So their key philosophy is, rationalism. And rationalism is the idea that people can explain why they do what they do, that people are capable of accounting for their actions, and they can explain it in a logical, intelligible manner so that we can understand what they did and why they did it. Values. So, they say subjective, and what they mean is like, the interpretive researcher realizes that if you're going to go into a culture and start interviewing people about what courtship means, that the researcher, him or herself, is going to have his or her own conceptions just because you live in this world and you've already grew up in a society that already tells you what a definition is. So you might have some difficulty separating like what they're teaching you, or like what the culture is teaching, like what the people you're studying are telling you, and what you normally believe. And so what you have to do as an interpretive researcher is you have to be reflexive. Okay, so the word is reflexive about your biases and what you're encountering at the time with whatever ideas that you're dealing with. And so being reflexive means being open about it. It's saying, look, this is what I think might influence me as I do this. Like here, as I'm doing this, here are some past experiences that I've had that might dictate how I'm doing this. And you're supposed to be open about it. See, in social science or in post-positivism, you're not even supposed to talk about that. You're supposed to just say, like, the method I designed by design shouldn't have any influences by me because I've designed it so that it shouldn't do that. But, what an interpretivist might argue is like, but even like the survey that you use will say something, and even by the design says something about what you believe about whatever it is that you're having people do. So we can't avoid subjectivity at some level with science. And so that's one of the little debates that you can have. Now, there are key methods, and there's 3 of them, and I'll just talk about each really quick. So in social science, you have the scientific method, the theory, the prediction, or hypothesis, the testing, and the feedback. With interpretive, there's 3 different routes you can go. And just really quickly here, you have hermeneutics. And hermeneutics is basically making sense of texts. So you might study conversations between people, or you might study, like if you're trying to understand how an organizational culture inspires its workers to do stuff, you might do an analysis of their mission statement. And that's like a hermeneutic analysis. It comes from like biblical hermeneutics, where you're trying to understand like what's the Bible telling me, but then it's applied to other fields for social science purposes. Then there's phenomenology. Phenomenology is about how we experience and make meanings of things that we encounter. So phenomenology is like, how did it feel like when this happened? What went through your mind when you first encountered and when you first came to America? What were the experiences that you had? How did you make sense of it all? You see what I mean? When a tornado ripped your house off its foundation, like how did you make sense of that? You know what I mean? Like how do you reconcile tornadoes and like the goodness in people? So phenomenology is about how do people make sense of things. And then also, it's also about making sense of taken for granted. So what do people take for granted in their daily interactions? Do you take for granted the fact that, like, you can call your parents by their first name? Maybe that's how you do it. You don't say mom and dad. You say Mark and Jane, you know, or whatever. Taken for granted that we just don't think about, or we don't have a word for. Phenomenology is about uncovering those. Then lastly, you have symbolic interactionism. I think my handwriting's okay. See, I'm left-handed, so it's hard for me to like write sometimes on these things. Okay, anyways, complaints. Symbolic interactionism is an area of research that looks at how symbols are being exchanged. Okay, and so if you want to understand like how deceptive sales practice arises through a business, you might look at their company reports, you might interview people, and you might look at texts, or you might look at all of it. You might look at how people react to the text, that kind of thing. So it's all about how do symbols get exchanged. So the key purpose is to understand. Sense making. Intelligibility. These are all words to describe what interpretivism is about. So when you're making something intelligible, you're just explaining this is how people work. So if you were to go into a culture to try to understand their courtship practices, what you're not trying to do is you're not trying to predict anything. You're not trying to say like, okay, I'm trying to understand courtship practices in this little tribe in the Amazon. So I'm going to create an experiment, or I'm going to use this theory that I learned that seemed to work in Ecuador, and I'm going to try to predict this is how people court. Instead, what you're going to do is you're going to go into the culture, you're going to learn about them, you're going to interview people, you're going to go to some of their events, and you're going to write about this is how people seem to court here, and here's what seems to be the key theoretical concepts, or here's the key ideas that I think best explain how they do courting. In a way, it's kind of like investigative journalism. I mean, I think that's one way to kind of put it, but it's like, but it has an academic purpose to it, and it's trying to advance a theoretical argument. It's not necessarily trying to get ratings or trying to just get people interested. There's some kind of theoretical purpose to it. Okay? All right. So let's keep going. So their view of reality. Reality is a constructivist. They're a constructionist approach. Excuse me. And with a constructionist approach, basically, people work together to create a social reality of some kind. So instead of reality kind of being this thing that's out there, it's rather what people make of it. And so it's not kind of, it's kind of looking at it as this is what this culture believes. So this is how we understand it. They could be wrong, like but you don't generally do that in interpretivism. You don't make judgments. So like, is this culture right for courting people at 16, like that's not an interest in interpretivism. Like that's a moral judgment that you're making, and that's just not the interest of social science. Social science isn't about making moral judgments about things. It's just understanding or predicting something, regardless if we think it's moral or not, right? We're just trying to get to the facts here, if you will. So when you're understanding social reality, what you're saying is this is how they make sense of the world, and that's what we should be interested in, is how they make sense of the world, and let's learn to do things according to their making sense of the world. Okay? And then human nature, patterns exist, but it's all about the norms and the conventions that people learn through. So human nature is determined by norms, patterns in culture. Okay? And when I say it's determined, like, that's what it's really about. So I should really say, I guess what I should really say, see, I can erase, that's pretty cool. Human nature is focused on I should say like that, something. Norms, patterns, cultures. That's what we're really interested in. And then on the subject of free will, so social scientists or post-positivists, they're obviously deterministic. So they believe that things out in the world cause you to do things. Okay, and I think I covered that in the previous slide, but if I didn't, there you go. So free will for social scientists, or post-positivists, I mean, free will for them is determined by external influences, okay, based on causes that they identify. Here, free will is out there, and so it's called voluntarism. I mean, there's different words for it, but in interpretive research, people do have free will. People can choose to follow a culture or a society or not. They can make sense of what's going on. They're aware of it. And so theory, a good interpretive theory will understand, make sense of something, and we evaluate it by description, and it's rich description, and text, data. So if somebody's going to make an interpretive claim, what they have to do is they have to give a lot of description of like what it is that they're claiming, and they got to be able to support it with observations, text, whatever it is, the artifact that they're analyzing. It all has to be there, and you have to convince people that you're right. You see what I mean? Social science tends to try to compel, like they'll say it's the numbers, but the numbers say this, so it doesn't matter what you believe, you know, and so they try to compel you. In interpretive, it's more like you got to convince your audience. So you're convincing your audience that this is probably the way that these people operate based on the observations that you made. Okay, so that's interpretive. Now we just have our last one. Oh, let me talk about, real quick, limitations. Okay, so there's a couple limitations to interpretivism then, and so we need to talk about those real quick. And one of them that a lot of people make is, number one, that, you know, often there are multiple meanings. So if you're trying to like come up with a representation of like what a culture believes about courtship, probably you're going to run into a lot of different meanings on courtship. And so an interpretivist who has to try to like summarize all this is going to do violence to all the multiple meanings or the minorities in the group and so forth, because you kind of have to weave it all into a broader story. Another problem, and this just depends on which paradigm you're coming from. I mean, some people, you know, kind of think that it's like it's too subjective. So like some people are kind of just like, if we have no way of really, if it's all based on like what the researcher sees, and even if it's supported by the data, there's still a lot of subjectivity into it because you're not controlling for things. So like you might think this is an adequate explanation, but how do you really know? You know, some people would have a problem with that. Okay, it's just too subjective in general. The researcher has way too much control. There's no way to verify it, what the researcher's saying. So all the little post-positivist ways of affirming a theory, they wouldn't like interpretive theories for that reason. So if they're coming from that paradigm, that's problematic to them. But within the imperative interpretive paradigm, that's okay because, you know, it's not necessarily about objective, subjective. It's about being open about it and being able to work through it. You know, and another thing is like, you know, it's hard to get general theories. So like, while post-positivism can be really broad and abstract, interpretivism can be very local. And the problem is just that local theories don't help. Like, it's an applicability issue. Like, so you understand how an interpretive theory works in this little culture in the Amazon, but how is that going to help us understand this culture in Russia? You know what I mean? So some people think it's too small, like it's too slow. And so that's a problem for people. So that's 3 problems, and there are obviously responses to these. So sure, I can list all these problems, and then somebody who's interpretive can be like, but multiple meanings, blah blah blah, and too subjective, blah blah blah, don't go too stuff, blah blah. Okay, and so people can have this discussion once again. Okay, lastly, we have the critical paradigm. Now, I'm not the strongest on this paradigm. Just being honest, like just reflexivity, right? I'm not the strongest with this paradigm. So I'm going to try to explain it as best I can. And so it's not that I don't like it or I hate it or anything like that. I'm just not as well trained in it. So here we go. So the critical theory is all about uncovering mechanisms of power. So when we're looking at critical theory, I should use black for this. Black, yeah. Okay. So critical theory is all about uncovering mechanisms of power. So your job as a critical theorist, essentially, is to look for power, oppression, and moments of resistance in a particular setting. So the idea of scholarship, then, is to free people from oppression, to let people know that you are being oppressed by doing a certain thing, or this and this is influencing how you're working or how you're living your life. You know what I mean? Like, you need to resist this kind of marketing, or you need to resist this kind of capitalism or this exercise of power, and learn to just live your own life, And so that's what critical theory is about liberation, okay? So power for them is both a thing and a performance. So power can be like, who has the power in this situation, the police officer or the criminal? Or it can be a performance, like, when people go to political rallies and do protests, they're exercising moments of resistance and thus operating some kind of power, okay? So this is also about covering ideology, or uncovering ideology. So ideology is this, is basically a belief about how the world should be. So when people, when you see magazines that say, you need to buy Calvin Klein because Calvin Klein is hot, that's an ideology, right? That you need to look like Calvin Klein, that you need to have the latest and greatest clothing that is available, that you need to be able to spend $150 on a pair of jeans so you can be like Calvin Klein, okay? And then you see the Calvin Klein models, and they're all buff and stuff, and that tells you oh, in order to be an ideal man, you need to be buff, you need to have a six-pack and have a chiseled jaw and all that stuff, okay? All of that is ideology, and ideology is in pretty much everything. Everybody wants you to do something. So this ties nicely into my persuasion class, by the way, if you're taking it. And so that's all part of the critical paradigm, okay? So their key philosophy is Marxism and a little bit of Foucault. I think I spelled Foucault right, yeah. So I can't make this a class on Marxism. I know enough about it to be able to explain it, but this lecture's already running pretty long, so I don't want to spend too much time. Basically, Marxism is this idea that we are basically commodities in a machine, and we basically do stuff for people and get very little reward for it, while other people make a lot of money and get to get all the good stuff while we get very little, okay? And part of the idea of Marxism was that ideology is embedded in things, and it's not always somebody overtly doing something. It can be implicit as well. And so that's kind of the very, very, very short. I missed a lot of stuff. I know all the fellow Marxists in the class are all upset now, but that's a very short, very small piece on Marxism. It's one of the most commonly read books in university, so if you want to read it, go ahead. And then key methods. So there's a lot of methods in critical theory that I'm aware of. And so the ones that I'm most familiar, though, with, so they do a lot of close readings. And close readings is basically a close critical text analysis of something. So we're going to do a close reading of Sarah Palin's speech about Donald Trump. and we're going to look for all the right-wing ideologies that are embedded, or we're going to look at all the racist ideologies that are embedded in Sarah Palin's speech, for example. That's a close reading, and so you have to read it very closely and look for those things that could be there. And then there's also like deconstruction. Deconstruction is kind of the same idea of how I discussed. Ooh, what am I doing? Deconstruction is kind of like the same thing, but I know I'm doing violence right now too, critical methods, but this gives you an idea. The idea is to uncover power. So reality then, for a critical theorist, is all political, right? It's all about the political configuration that you live in. That's your reality. So if it's a capitalist society, your reality is going to have a lot of capitalist ideology embedded into it because that's what you were raised in. And so you're going to think that, okay, the way to advance in this world is to climb the corporate ladder. I just got to get a job, and then I just got to get promoted, and then I'll get rich. And during this time, I can buy stuff, and I can have more things. That's all the reality stuff. And then, let's see. Human nature, and it's kind of like sad, but it's like people are part of a greater whole. Like people are in a way are kind of like cogs in a machine, if you will. Controlled by an upper class or upper power. Okay, so what we have to do then is, with number 5, free will, liberate people through awareness. Awareness and resistance. So to liberate people, you have to first off let them know that, hey, you are oppressed, and then you have to show them, like, here's how we can reform what it is that we need to do. Okay? So, and a lot of times critical theory will look at race, class, and gender. That's kind of like the trinity of critical paradigm, race, class, and gender. So you'll see a lot of stuff on like feminism, racism, homophobia, those kinds of things. And a good theory will be one that identifies systematic oppression. And, a good theory finds oppression. And of course, it's supported too. It's going to be supported by data. All 3 of these paradigms rely on data. Like, it's not like one is just like free for all. I can say whatever I want. No, it's like you have to support it with data. So that's what makes all 3 of them technically social sciences, is that they're all empirically based. It's just how they go about interpreting the data, doing things with the data, and the overall ends of the data. That's what these all differ on. And then, a good or bad explanation will be supported then by data. Liberation, recognition. So data, liberation. So the critical paradigm, if post-positivism is objective, interpretive is subjective, critical paradigm is political. Okay, so to put this all together, here's a little chart to kind of explain, once again, a lot of things that I just talked about here. So now let's do an example of a study to show you, how all 3 differ. So let's go back to that Call of Duty and violence study, okay? So, somebody's all like, I want to see if violence makes girls playing Call of Duty more violent, or playing Call of Duty more violent. Okay, so if you were a post-positivist, here's how you might go about it. You would look for law-like relations among objects. So you would look for, hours played of Call of Duty, and then acts of violence. That would probably be your X and your Y. So your X, hours played, your Y would be violence, right? X causes Y. What's the relation between the two? Okay? And so you're going to look at it as like a science thing. You're going to try to maybe get quantitative data. You may do an experiment. You might do a survey. You're going to look for the disorder. How can we make sense of this kind of thing? And what's the best theory that can explain that? And then, you're going to be looking for control, okay? That's what you're going to be looking for. And so let's say that, you came up with a theory, okay? So you're like, yes, Call of Duty, when girls play more than 20 hours of Call of Duty, then they all become violent and they start beating up their little brothers. Okay, so somebody's going to be, and they're all like, see, we did science. You see what I mean? We were science. Okay, we have numbers, you see, and all that stuff. So they think that they've solved the problem now. But then the interpretive person comes along, okay, and they're like, okay, but you have to understand that violence is different to people. Like, people make sense of Call of Duty differently. Like, Call of Duty doesn't have the same effects to one person than to another. I mean, maybe somebody who plays Call of Duty 20 hours doesn't get violent at all because it doesn't mean anything to them. Or maybe, they have beliefs in their family or in their local culture that they know violence is bad, so they don't do it. So while you think you have all the science and stuff, but you're really overlooking the important details, the context, and how people make sense of violence, which really, at the end of the day, is what people live by. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to interview a bunch of girls who do play Call of Duty and see what violence means to them, and what is an act of violence, and what is the kind of violence that Call of Duty has, and what is playing Call of Duty for? What does that mean to them? What level or what amount of significance do they give to it? So they're going to be doing hermeneutics and ethnography, okay? And they're going to be interested in making sense of them maybe as a community. So maybe they'll study like a community of girls who play Call of Duty. And what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to, make sense of it, right? They're going to do this. We're going to deal with meaninglessness, okay? So maybe what they'll find is like when girls play Call of Duty, to them it's a bonding experience with other people. And the killing, they don't really think that much about it because it's just not really what it's all about. It's all about playing on a team and being part of people. And so, that's what it is. It has nothing to do with them wanting to be more violent. And in fact, violence isn't really even, like the way that violence is measured in, the previous study, girls, that's not really what it is to them. You know what I mean? So you would be trying to understand what this all means to them, and then saying, look, like, the problem isn't Call of Duty per se, it's the meanings that girls are attributing to Call of Duty that may be the problem. And so what we need to do is we need to come down to their level, live in their social world, and figure out ways to where we can conceptualize Call of Duty to a way where they no longer feel like they need to be violent if they end up being violent. You see what I mean? So it's all about understanding and living in their world and integrating into it. Then the critical might be like, okay, but that may not be the right answer because you're forgetting domination here. You're forgetting that video game playing is a very male-dominated institution, and women often feel very oppressed because it's all these guys and they get sexually harassed and all this stuff. And so, you're going to be you're forgetting all of those aspects that go into it. So sure, maybe your girls in your interview said that Call of Duty is a bonding experience for them, but they're not aware that you haven't uncovered the power structures that have, caused them to maybe want to say that. So what we really need to do is we need to analyze conversations between girls and Call of Duty and look for ideologies. And we need to look at the political ads or the advertising ads of Call of Duty, and we need to see where all the domination is coming from, so then we can learn what's really oppressing women and causing them to maybe become more violent or whatever, and then, figure out what power structures we can attack to free them. Now, of course, this is a very cartoonish study. Like, obviously, studies are a lot more complex than this, but then you can kind of see at least how it all plays out, right? Are you trying to predict? Are you trying to understand? Or are you trying to change? Okay, so that's the one thing to remember. Post-positivism, predict. Interpretivism, understand. And critical, change. Those are the three different ways of knowing. Okay, so that's pretty much it. This is a very deep lecture. It's about epistemology and all of that. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask in the forums. And I look forward to seeing how you do on your quiz and assignments. Go team.